With the Mississippi State University Extension Service in Hancock County, and today I am going to be talking to you about planting a fall garden. And you may notice that I am talking to you about planting a fall garden still relatively early in the summer. It's the start of June, but I think it's a good idea to start thinking about your fall garden a little earlier in the year. And that way we can talk about a little bit of preparation. We can, think about what plants and plant varieties we might be interested in. I think that's really helpful. So one of the advantages of being down here in the southern United States is that we do get to plant these fall gardens. We have a relatively long summer, mild winters, so that allows us to get that second crop of plants in during the year. So, having that fall garden can allow us to have fresh vegetables really right into the winter, right up until that first good frost that we're going to have. And the second part of that is that our summers can be a little intense. Really hot down here, so sometimes there are just some vegetables that are going to be better adapted to those cooler temperatures and will actually perform better for us in the fall and into the winter than they will coming into the summer. So again, we can extend our garden season all the way into winter. We can get that, fresh produce and fresh crops continuing on after some of our other crops may start to fail to produce. Another aspect of that is sometimes, particularly if we might be a new gardener, sometimes some things can happen in our spring garden that just make it a little bit less successful than we would like it to be. And because of that, we are able to get that second season in. If we have a difficulty planting, or if we have something that goes on with our spring garden, we just have a second chance to get that fresh produce and enjoy it from our home garden. As I mentioned, there are some cool season vegetables, things like carrots and broccoli, cauliflower, even Brussels sprouts. They taste better. Their quality is just really increased when they mature during cool weather. Another problem we might face is things like vegetables like lettuce and spinach tend to get a little bit of a bitter flavor when they grow in hot conditions. And even worse, they may bolt on us. I'm going to talk a little bit about bolting here in a second. But mainly those leaves just really develop a bitter flavor that's kind of unpleasant. They're just going to taste a lot better when they mature in cool weather than if they have hot weather while they're maturing. So bolting can be really frustrating, particularly for a newer gardener. And bolting is just the premature production of flowering stems before the plant is ready to be harvested. So if you've ever planted spinach or broccoli or cauliflower or anything like that, and you come outside and all of a sudden it is sent up a stalk that has yellow flowers all over it, then that plant has bolted. And it's really common, particularly in our cool season crops, things like lettuces and brassicas. And as I mentioned, after that plant bolts, oftentimes it's going to have a really bitter taste to it. The leaves will be really tough. It's just not going to have the quality that we want. Now, most of the time, bolting is a response to the weather. So if we start to have cool days, exactly what we want for those cool season crops, and then, like we do, we tend to have a little, peak of warm weather, in there at the end of the year. That, gets interpreted by the plant as it's time to bloom, and they send up that stalk and put up those flowers, and that can result in that problem. Another thing that can result in bolting is stress on the plant. If the plant doesn't have enough water, or if its nutrition is not ideal, that can make that plant a little bit more prone to bolting than it would be otherwise. Now, some things that we can do to help prevent bolting, and honestly, it is going to be something that happens to us just as the weather changes. But if we can protect our plants with covers or cold frames during cold spells, that really can help. And you do want to pay attention to choosing plant varieties that are going to be resistant to bolting. Another good idea when we're looking at some of these fall crops is when we're sowing our seeds, when we're putting out plants, we don't necessarily want to do that all at once. So, maybe planting seeds or putting out transplants every 2 weeks rather than planting all at one time allows us to just kind of hedge our bets and make sure that we get that crop in there to a point where we're really going to have an ideal harvest time. Now, it is possible to hold over our gardens from spring all the way into fall. So tomato plants and peppers and eggplant can absolutely continue to produce until the cold finally does kill them. In fact, I have managed to keep pepper plants for multiple years, and I know several people who've talked to me about tomato plants that they've managed to keep for longer than I might have imagined. So it is possible to do that. Okra tends to perform really well for us and continue to produce. So if we're going to do that, we want to make sure that we're taking really good care of those plants. So we want to make sure that we stay on top of controlling insects and weeds and diseases. Make sure that we're watering really well and keeping the plant well fertilized. Because any of those attacks, whether it be from insects or weeds, are going to slow that plant down a little bit, make it a little bit more prone to other problems, and reduce its health, prevent us from being able to keep it over into the fall. While certainly we'd love to keep our spring garden going, a good fall garden isn't going to be just keeping that summer garden alive. What we're going to do is we're going to plant new vegetables, get that produce in the fall and into early winter. And to do that, we need to make sure that we're planting right. We have good cultural practices, particularly managing our water and managing our fertilization to make sure that we're going to have a good, healthy garden. Some things we can do to prepare the site. Of course, we've just pulled out our spring garden. So we want to make sure that we're removing all of that old crop residue. Make sure, my advice with that is it's a great opportunity to, chop it up, get it into the compost pile, start working on some compost that you're going to be able to put out in the following year. It is also a good idea, if you're in the ground, tilling your spading down to 6 to 8 inches. Not only is that going to loosen up the soil and make the ground a little bit easier for the plants to grow in, they also help take care of some of your weed problems, as well as take care, if you leave a little bit of crop residue in it that may have some remnant of a plant disease, by tilling that soil under, you can kind of separate it from your new plants and help manage weeds and disease at the same time. You do want to keep in mind that our fall vegetables are going to need fertilizer, just like our spring and summer ones do. And oftentimes, because we've produced all those plants, all of those nutrients been taken up by those spring and summer vegetables. So oftentimes we are going to need to add a little bit more nutrition to the soil, make sure that we're producing good, healthy plants. This is particularly the case for nitrogen, because not only do we have to worry about the plants having taken up that nutrient, but oftentimes it will leach out due to rainfall and other factors. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing a soil test in preparation for your fall garden. I often refer to soil test as the best $8 you can spend in horticulture. I just think that makes a really easy way to make sure that you're providing all of the nutrition that the plants need. And oftentimes we are looking at growing some different plants. So we may need to direct that soil test at things like our brassicas and broccoli and cauliflower rather than some of our summer vegetables. Now, as a general rule, you can apply 1 to 2 pounds of a complete fertilizer, something like triple 10 or triple 13, per about 100 square foot of your bed space, and incorporate that in. And that's just kind of targeted at replacing a lot of the nutrients that may have been lost from your spring garden. Now, another really important factor for our fall gardens is when we should plant. And we need to take into account from that how long the plant takes to mature, as well as when we are going to get our first frost. So, warm season vegetables, we're planting them in midsummer for fall harvest. We have to have additional time to mature because our weather is going to be cooling down as we get into September and October. Oftentimes we look at seed packets and other things like that, and they will actually tell us how long we should expect for those crops to mature. And it's a good idea to add about 10 days to that when we're looking at fall crops, because oftentimes as those temperatures are dropping down in the fall, those cooler temperatures result in the plant growing slower. So you can take a look at this map of Mississippi, and this shows what the average first frost date is going to be for all over the state of Mississippi. And you can kind of, if you're listening from another state, you can kind of get a pretty good idea of what you might be looking at. But this first frost date is going to kind of represent the end of your season. So you want to be able to plan for that. Way down here in South Mississippi, I'm in Hancock County. You can see that our first frost date is from around the middle of November to the start of December. If you go up into the northern parts of the state, you can get a little bit further, as late as, or as you get up northern in the state, you're going to be a little bit earlier than that. If you're up in DeSoto County or Tishomingo County or Alcorn County, you may have that first frost date as early as the end of October. And I always tend to think of that first part, that first date as being the line that I'm aiming at as being the end of my season. And if I get anything after that, then that's just a little bit of a bonus. So I went ahead and I looked at some different plants and when I would recommend planting them for a variety of locations around the state, looking at how many days to harvest they are. And I'm not gonna read out every single one, but just kind of give you a pretty good idea. And again, if you're further south in the state, you're going to be able to plant a little bit later. If you're up north, you're going to need to plant a little bit more on the early end of those dates. So you can see, for snap beans and bush beans, pole beans, and that sort of thing. We're looking at starting planting in August and finishing out towards the end of August, or rather the end of August or just into the month of September in order to get that harvest. As we look at broccoli and cauliflower and Brussels sprouts, we're looking at getting plants in the ground as early as the middle of July for the northern parts of the state. And then down here in the southern parts of the state, we can plant throughout the month of August. We really want to watch out for Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts really just have a long development time, and it can be really difficult to get them to produce, particularly down here in the south of the state. We've been successful with them a few times, but they do require just a long period to develop that can be quite challenging. As we get into our greens, whether that be lettuce or cabbages and chard, into our spinach and mustard, planting starting in the earlier part of August into September, You can see there for collards, you can plant them a pretty long period of time, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on, but just gives you a good range of ideas about when you're looking at planting for different crops. Now, of course, everybody's interested in those fall tomatoes. If you are planting from seed, it's starting to get towards the time when you would want to start thinking about putting those down. If you're in the northern part of the state, down here, I always plant my seeds for tomatoes for the fall on or around the 4th of July, and that allows me to get those plants out towards the middle of August. Of course, you are going to want to be really mindful of what varieties you're using there because of the range of different times that those plants require in order to produce. Squash and pumpkin and cucumber, I'm going to talk a little bit more about pumpkins after a little bit because they're a little bit of a special case. Squash, I'll actually be replanting them almost in the next couple of days. They can be planted again all the way up until the 15th of August. Cucumber is very much the same. And then as we get into beets and carrots and rutabaga, I don't know a whole lot of people who grow a lot of rutabaga, but it's a crop I enjoy. Looking at the middle of August or start of September all the way into October for beets and really up to the start of November for carrots. One thing we want to be mindful of when we are planting seeds for the summer and fall is that we do have really hot, dry weather as we get into July and August and September, and that can be really challenging for seeds and for young seedlings. Can lead to a lot of stress. When we're looking at seed germination, if we are planting outside, if we're direct seeding, we want to make sure that we water very well a day or two before we plant so that we're getting those seeds down into moist soil. And if we water immediately after we plant, very often that can cause the surface to pack in and crust, which can make it difficult for those plants to be able to germinate and perk up above the soil. There's some other things. Of course, I produce most of my plants as transplants that I'm then moving out to the garden. In cases like that, make sure we're using things like peat moss and vermiculite that don't crust over quite as easily. One thing you might want to do, again, if you're direct seeding, is plant those seeds just a little bit deeper than you would normally for a spring vegetable, and that's just going to reduce the threat of that that seed drying out as it's germinating, and you can get a little bit better of a stand. Keep the surface moist while the plants are germinating, and if you want to make life easy, if you're starting off in transplants, you can germinate seeds on a moistened paper towel. Just moisten the paper towel, put the seeds on it, moisten it again, cover it over with another paper towel. Really keep that really good and humid, and you'll see the seeds start to germinate there. Where we are direct seeding, if we're talking about broccoli or cabbage or collards, we often do direct seed those in the fall, and it is really important to have enough moisture available to keep those plants available, growing actively after germination. Again, we want to watch out to not form that hard crust over the seed, particularly with some of our heavy clay soils. We also want to pay attention to the temperature outside because plants like lettuce and spinach are going to have difficulty germinating if that soil temperature is above 85 degrees. Oftentimes what we do when we're putting these seeds out is we're putting a lot more seed out than we actually intend to grow. So we'll put 3 to 5 seeds, things like broccoli or cabbage, and then thin that down once the seedlings are established to make sure that we get a good stand out in the garden. Of course, again, I do most of my planting as transplants. We want to start those in individual containers or seedling flats, using a really good soil media. A lot of the potting mixes are really good for this, regardless of what brand it is. They're a good aerated soil that holds moisture well. And ideally what we want to do is we want to germinate those seeds between 75 and 80 degrees. As long as we're not keeping our houses ice cold, usually our temperature inside is pretty good for this, as long as we put them in an area where they're going to get adequate light. So make sure that we keep that temperature right between 75 and 80 degrees. If we can, maintain that moisture, make sure we're watering our seedlings frequently to make sure that they're growing well. And that'll produce really good transplants. And I have found that producing transplants for my fall garden tends to go a good bit quicker than I expect it to, or quicker than I would expect for a spring garden, because we do have higher temperatures, and that can make those transplants grow just a little bit faster. Now, when we get our transplants out to the garden, we want to make sure that we provide them the best environment possible. We want to limit disrupting their root system as much as we possibly can. Make sure that we water them in very thoroughly. We really need to establish a good connection between the groundwater and the water around the roots of that plant right when we get it into the ground. And that will reduce, one thing that we see a lot when we put transplants out is we see some shock. So we might see the plant start yellowing, even have leaves turn white as a result of that shock. So making sure that we have good water connection and we haven't damaged the roots can help with that. If we're particularly hot, it is absolutely possible to provide shade for the seedlings. You can use shade cloth, as you see in that top picture, or you can get creative with it, and whatever is going to provide a little bit of shade can do a good job for you. If you have an old beach umbrella laying around, anything that works for you is great. So I am going to talk about a few specific crops for fall gardens, and fall tomatoes are a really popular one. We can get really good fall tomatoes here in Mississippi. I honestly think they're a little bit better than the spring tomatoes. Just when we're mulching, we need to make sure we're mulching, we're irrigating, fertilizing, making sure we're having a good pest control program. That's great for getting those spring plants through the fall. But oftentimes, as those plants get a little bit older, the fall fruit just aren't as big on the plant as what we would see if we just went ahead and planted a new run of plants. And that's going to give us really good, large, attractive fruit. As we mentioned earlier, we want to start those seedlings in June or up to early July. Get those plants out in July into middle August, depending on where you are in the state. And we want to make sure that we choose our varieties with that maturity time in mind. So, if you're looking at that schedule and when that first frost date is going to be, you want to make sure that you're choosing a variety that's going to be able to develop and set fruit and be able to be harvested prior to when that date comes along. One thing that I really like to do is to use suckers from my established tomato plants, my spring tomato plants, in order to produce my next plants. It is phenomenally easy to root suckers from a tomato plant. You can see a good picture of what that sucker is going to look like. You'll have the branch coming off the tomato or the leaf coming off the tomato plant, and then the upright stem of that tomato plant. And then right in the middle of that angle, you're going to have that sucker coming off, and you can tell by the end of it that it's a sucker, because the end of that sucker is going to look like the top of a plant rather than just having a leaf there. So really easy, just cut those suckers off with a really good sharp blade. A pair of pruning shears can work, or just a real good sharp knife. You can use some rooting hormone with that and put them directly in the soil, or put them in water, and you and the young people around you can watch the roots start to form. Really let those roots get going, and then start them off in some soil. And in my mind, that just allows me to get a little bit of a jump on the plants that I want for the fall. I already know that I like those varieties. I like those plants. I do want to make sure when I do that I'm not choosing suckers from any plants that may have had some bad insect problems or bad disease problems, because I don't want to carry that over into the next season as well. But I had a run on tomato plants this year. I had all of my plants in, and then I had some people asking me for some tomato plants because they wanted to start a garden. And I just went out to my garden and cut a bunch of suckers and started them. And a week later, I had quite a few plants to give away. So this can be a really successful way to approach getting that second crop of tomatoes. Talk really quickly about carrots, just because it's something people tend to enjoy growing in the fall. Here in Mississippi, we tend to have pretty heavy clay soils, and so some of the longer varieties of carrots can be a little bit difficult and just not grow very well. So selecting some shorter varieties tends to produce better here than those longer varieties. Carrot seeds can be a little bit difficult to germinate. Oftentimes we are direct seeding these, and we'll be out in the garden, we'll be trying to put down our carrots, and we'll lose track of where our carrots are. So one thing you can do just as a trick to remind yourself where you've planted those carrots is to mix a few radish seed in there. You can keep the radish as well, but that just helps you mark where your row is. It's a good idea if you can cover that planted row with some clear plastic or with a floating row cover. That will help you get a good stand, and just remove that after you get germination. And it's a good idea, remove some sort of non-crusting material, something like sawdust or vermiculite, can help keep that newly seeded row moist and improve your germination. You do want to thin them down to about 2 inches apart. And oftentimes on your carrots, you will get kind of a green top on them. That is a result of being exposed to the sun, and just moving some soil there to make sure you're covering the row and covering that root system, or the carrot root that we want. That'll help keep that green shoulders thing from happening. Of course, it wouldn't be a Mississippi fall garden if we didn't have greens, and there are an awful lot of things that fall into this category. Everything from kale to spinach and mustard and turnips. Usually we are going to seed these at a 1-inch row spacing, and that's when we're going to harvest them by cutting leaves. If we're going to take up the whole plant, we want to seed them about 2 to 3 inches apart. Collards may be a little bit different if you're breaking off individual leaves. We can see collard transplants for sale at most for big box stores and garden stores, and you want to transplant those into the ground about 1 foot apart. We can get our first planting for those in as early as August, and then continue on through the winter all the way into April, planting at 2-week intervals. One thing that some people do will just be to plant again whenever they have emergence of the plants that they just put in a little bit ago. And that can really speed you up, because some of these plants can be ready to harvest really in just as few as 5 weeks, depending on the weather that we have and the temperature that we're having. Broccoli and cauliflower are two of my favorite things to grow as we get into the fall. If the weather is okay, you can direct seed these. I'll often produce transplants for both of them, just because I tend to have an easier time that way. You want to harvest broccoli while that cluster of flowers is still tight. As the plant develops, that will start to open up. And cauliflower can be a little bit more challenging because it's a little bit less tolerant of heat and cold. So we want to make sure in both cases that we're selecting some early maturing varieties in order to avoid those fall temperatures. Where we're looking at cauliflower, they do have some varieties that are called self-blanching varieties, and they sort of protect the top of the cauliflower from exposure to the sun. That can prevent that really nice white head on there, give it that kind of a purple color. If you don't have one of those varieties, you do want to tie the outer leaves together over the center of the plant when you still have a pretty small head on them. And then about 7 to 12 days later, kind of depending on temperature, that plant's going to be ready to go out and harvest. Of course, with broccoli, you may be able to get multiple heads off of it. Cauliflower, you're just going to have that one head. So once that plant's harvested, that's the only head you're going to get off of it. One issue that you will occasionally see with broccoli and cauliflower is that you develop hollow stems, and that is as a result of boron deficiency. And so you can mix a tablespoon of just household borax, boric acid in 3 gallons of water. Apply that to 100 feet of row, and that will give you all of the boron that you need to avoid that problem. You do want to watch. You don't want to oversupply boron to the soil because you can get some toxicities if you do that. Toxicities to the plant, not to anything else. One note that I would like to add on broccoli and cauliflower. Oftentimes I'll see people harvesting broccoli, broccoli particularly, or cauliflower as well, and they harvest the head and then they just get rid of the rest of the plant. I actually enjoy the leaves of these. They are quite tasty. You can cook them down just like you do other greens. They have a really nice flavor. They cook down really well, so that's a great product that you might not think of out there in the garden. All right, pumpkins. Most of our pumpkins, a lot of times we're growing those for decorations. A lot of times we're planting them for Halloween. So usually we want to plant those in late June and early July. They're going to require anywhere from about 90 to 110 days from planting to harvest. Pumpkins do take up quite a lot of space, have a really sprawling habit. We plant them in rows that are 7 feet apart and space seeds about 4 to 5 feet apart. Within the row, if it's a vining variety, they do have some semi-vining or bush varieties of pumpkin that can be planted a little bit closer than that. And when you plant them, you want to plant 4 to 5 seeds together and then thin that down as they emerge, just to make sure that you get a good stand there. And you really want to pay attention to variety when you're looking at pumpkins because they have a range of different sizes and types out there, all the way from a little bit bigger than a softball all the way up to some really giant pumpkins. Most of the ones we use, if we're looking at a carving pumpkin, it's going to be in that 10 to 30 pound range, and there are some varieties that are popular for that. And then the smaller pumpkins from 5 to 10 pounds are really what we're looking at for cooking or for pies, and some varieties that are recommended for that. Don't want people to forget herbs for their fall gardens. Just like other plants, some of our herbs do fantastically well in the fall and may actually perform a little bit better. Parsley does fantastic in the fall. As does sage, rosemary, and thyme. And really, you just have everything that you need right there for Thanksgiving, performing really well in your fall garden. Cilantro, also coriander, because the seed of the cilantro plant is the coriander herb or culinary herb. Does fantastically well under, as the temperature gets cooler. And mint also thrives well as we get into that cooler temperature also. So it's a great time to get out there, as you're putting in that fall garden, to include some of these herbs. Now, some things we want to pay attention to in a fall garden. We want to make sure that we're controlling insects because as a lot of times insects have more than one generation per year, and because of that, you might have 50 females come out in the first generation, and each one lays 100 eggs, 50 of which are female. And so you wind up with a lot of bugs really fast as a result of that kind of magnification as they go through generations. So it can be a little bit challenging to make sure that we're getting effective control of our insects in these fall gardens. We really need to be careful to be out there monitoring and checking for bugs and making sure that we're doing the things we can to reduce those problems. Another reason why we may have a little bit more difficulty with insects in the fall is what we call the funnel effect. So the pest populations are building up through the summer, and then a lot of their food sources go away. So a lot of, there are less gardens in the fall than there are in the spring. Other food sources may be dying down. So those young, really well-watered, late season vegetable crops are going to be very attractive and draw those insects in. We also want to make sure, really for the same reasons that we're controlling disease in our fall gardens, those disease populations can increase much the same way as insect populations do. And again, those young plants can be really susceptible to damage by disease organisms. And I've showed this slide several times before in different presentations, just the really important practices to make sure that we are managing disease. And I cannot stress sanitation enough. Removing plant debris or removing diseased plants from the garden can be a really effective way to just isolate that out and keep it from being able to reinfect your plants. Using mulches can be really important, just provides a barrier between the ground and your plant. Because a lot of those disease organisms will survive on the ground or in plant residue that's on the ground. Watering, always want to water at the appropriate time. Make sure we're providing enough water for the plants, but also make sure that we're not wetting the plant leaves any longer than we really have to. Make sure that we're using disease-free seed, using seed from a reputable source, buying good healthy transplants, and use resistant varieties if we have a history of a particular problem in our garden. Of course, chemical control of insects and diseases is an important component of that. You want to make sure when we do that, that we are accurately diagnosing the problem, that we know what insect we're trying to control, or we know what disease we're trying to control. Of course, I encourage you to contact your county extension agent, because one of the services we provide is to give you a description of what that particular organism might be and what pesticide, whether it be an insecticide or fungicide, is going to be most effective for its control. Now, we want to make sure that we're applying it where it's going to work. We want to make sure that we're applying it where it's going to work and on something that's going to work on. And we do want to pay attention to weather. Some pesticides, particularly when it's really hot out there, things like horticultural oils or copper products can be damaging to plants. You can see some phytotoxicity. So we want to make sure we're paying attention to that and obeying the label when we use any of those products. Just talk a little bit about temperature extremes. Of course, it will be quite warm when we start off the fall garden. Keep in mind that a lot of our plants are going to have difficulty setting fruit or forming seeds when those daytime temperatures are over 90 degrees or when night temperatures are over 75 because heat will destroy pollen and interfere with fertilization. And also plants may wilt a little bit more cause a lot more water loss, and plants may be more susceptible to moisture loss and to drought stress. So we want to make sure that we're paying attention to our watering to provide those plants all of that resource that they need. As we get towards the end of the fall season, we may need to look at a little bit of cold protection. Oftentimes, we can get through that first little frost if we do things to protect the plants from that event. Because oftentimes after that first frost, we will still have a couple of weeks of good growing conditions so that we can continue on our garden. Some of our more hardy plants may not require protection, but some of our plants will. Root crops, things like carrots and radishes, either harvest them or mulch them heavily prior to a hard freeze. We can, if we mulch that, we can usually get our harvest extended well into the winter, or even into the spring if we have a mild winter. If you've got growing beds or raised beds, you can put a floating row cover or other cover over them. Support that with stakes or wire to keep that material from directly touching the plant. You can even use things like milk cartons or other things like milk jugs to put them directly over an individual plant. And that can create a little bit of a greenhouse environment, keep that temperature up in order to protect that plant from the early frost. Now, as we get into preparing for spring, we want to make sure we're doing all of the things we need to do. We're cleaning up all of our plant debris. We're storing our stakes and our poles. Ideally, we should also be cleaning those stakes and poles to make sure we don't have any disease organisms on them. Go ahead and get that soil test ready. I encourage you to do that towards the end of the year rather than the beginning. And then you can go ahead and till and start to get ready for our spring garden that is going to start off with things like English peas and Irish potatoes. And I want to close out this talking about fall gardens with a note on safety. It is really hot when we're talking about late July and August in Mississippi. So if you are out working in your garden, I encourage you to drink plenty of water. Make sure you're replacing your salt and your minerals. Wear appropriate clothing. Wear sunscreen so that you don't get badly sunburned. Loose-fitting long sleeves, in my mind, are a lot better than short sleeves, just in terms of keeping the sun off you and keeping safe. Schedule your outdoor activities according to your capability for being out there. As we get into the hottest parts of the year, I'm going to do my best to be out in the early morning and the evening when the temperatures are a little bit cooler, the sun's not beating down on me. Make sure you pace yourself. You don't want to get overworked and overheat. If you need to go and stay cool indoors, go and do that. It's not a bad idea. If you've got the opportunity to be outside working with someone, I encourage you to do that, or at least let somebody know that you're out there working. Be aware of the potential dangers of heat exhaustion and heat stroke. If you start to feel tired or weak, or if you start to feel dizzy, start to be sweating really heavily or feel nauseous, all of that are symptoms of heat exhaustion. If you're out there and you've stopped sweating, that really is a danger sign. And you want to get inside, make sure that you're taking care of yourself, drink plenty of water, and just be safe out there and have a good time in your garden. So with that, that is the conclusion of my remarks. With that, I'm going to open up for anybody who has any questions.